We're talking about Neon Genesis Evangelion, or Evangelion, or how the fuck you want to pronounce that word. And this is a tough one, guys. This is a very tough one. You see, the reason it's a tough one is because this anime, this one anime, does not manage to fall into a category of good or bad. It's not even really in between. You just don't know what it is. You either obsessively love it or you despise it with a passion. I've never seen a middle ground, and the fact that I think I can have a middle ground for this and objectively talk about it, one way or the other, somebody's gonna get pissed off, and, oh God, I don't know what to say. Okay. I figured it out. Figured out how we're going to do this. And how to make my hair not so crazy. Just do it so formulaic. We'll just do it the way I usually do it. We'll just talk about it. And we'll just talk about it. And hopefully that works. Everybody in agreement with this? Okay. Let's get this started. Neon Genesis Evangelion is the anime to end it all. And that doesn't mean the anime reviews are done. It just means that any conversation about anime that you have will eventually lead into this. It is the beginning and end of all things because it is so fucking weird and hard to place. Why? Well, we're going to try and look at that. So let's start out with the setting here. Neon Genesis Evangelion takes place in a world where angels, and by extension I suppose God, has contacted the Earth and caused something called the First Impact. It nearly wiped out the planet. God's pissed. Again. Well, we're humans and we're tenacious and we got free will from that sumbitch. So, we decided to make these things called Eva units, which are giant robots that are modeled somewhat after the angels. Go figure. Now, these units can kill the angels and prevent what would be known as second impact and possibly the destruction of humanity as we know it. So you would think, right off the bat, right, that only the most hardened, well-trained, and seasoned war veterans could pilot them, and you are so fucking wrong. Nope, you get these three teenagers, Shinji Ikari, Asuka Soryu, I think, and Rei Aname. Those three, and please forgive me if I pronounce any last names wrong, but those are the three that you get, and they're all these emotionally fucked up teenagers, mentally too. Now, we'll talk about the characters in due time. You see, this setting is actually a very interesting one. It's in a world that is close to its end, and there's a lot of science-ness, and there's a lot of science-y mumbo-jumbo going on, as well as a lot of religion that's brought into this. And that formula worked pretty well. And, it sounds pretty good. And to be fair and to be honest, I'll say it right now. I like Neon Genesis. I don't obsess over it. I don't love it. I watched it when it was on TV, and I watched it all the way through, and then I watched it again. I really liked it. I thought it was really good. But the second time I watched it, I was older. I was like 18. And I noticed there were some issues that could be had with it. And I know a lot of people that hate this show, and I can understand it. I really fucking can. So we're going to talk about that. But I just want it to be clear that I like this show. As much as I'm going to bitch about it, I enjoyed this show and still do. So, let's start the bitching. And we're going to start off with the plot now. And the setting's the setting was right there, and the plot is really what you have to get into to understand more of this show. And there's a lot of imagery I can't really describe to you, and that makes it harder. But anyway, the plot of this show, God, we're already hitting walls. The plot of this show is really weird to describe because I I'm not sure, and I'm not sure, and I don't feel like anybody could be, that this show has one set plot. You see, we're going to talk about what this show started out as and what it became, because it's hard to talk about just the plot. You see, this show started out as a monster of the week kind of thing, you know. There's a big evil, let's go kill it, and turned into this psychological melodrama about these three teenagers. And they kind of took over the plot after that. That being said, I have some complaints and I have some likes. You know, there are pros and cons with this. Here we go. So with Neon Genesis Evangelion, this show starts out with these three teenagers, Shinji, Asuka, and Rei, that I mentioned earlier. They pilot Eva units, which are essentially robot angels, to destroy the angels and prevent the second impact. Well, they all have these emotional problems. Shinji is hated by his father, his mother's dead, he hates himself, he has no self-confidence, and add to that he knows his world's ending, he's been placed with this incredible burden to save it, and he's going through puberty. Asuka's hard for me to say anything positive about, but essentially she watched her mom die in front of her, and that kind of makes her a bitch. And Rei is very quiet, and there are going to be spoilers now, so if you want to tune out, please do. Rei is very quiet, because she knows she's expendable, because she's made of the DNA of Shinji's mother, and we'll delve more into that in a little bit. So, but those three are your three Eva pilots. They have a watcher, but I'm not going to dive into her too much, because even though she is important to the show and is actually a very good character, in fact, a lot of the characters in this are very interesting and are done very well, and I like that about this show. But the plot really sticks with Shinji and the three Eva pilots, and because of that, because they, I feel, contain so much of this show, and there's so much potential to talk about them, and there's so much that should be said about them as compared to anybody else who I may not have a complaint with. That's who we're going to focus on. But their watcher, she is a very good character, and I have no problems with her, just so we're clear. Okay, so these three pilot Eva units and they fight angels. That's pretty much the plot. There is some focus on their emotional and mental states, which I think is really cool, especially in the beginning, because with Neon Genesis Evangelion, it does do a very good job at taking your mind off of the plot at the world at large and letting you focus on these three characters and their plights. And that's a good thing and a terrible thing all at once. You see, anybody that can... I think it's very important that you do that, because when you have a show and you have characters that, you know, are just basically there so you have characters, I feel that hurts the show. So when these characters have their own beliefs and their own interests, they makes them feel more human and therefore more relatable. Problem with this is, in Neon Genesis, these characters are kind of hard to like. At least your three main characters are. Very hard to like at points. In fact, I think the fan favorite is Rei, and she's pretty much emotionally not there. So there you go. Anyway, so it starts out as that, basically. Some teenage angst and melodrama with them coming to grasp with what they're doing, as well as themselves, as well as, oh look, big bad, go fucking kill it. And that's how it stays for the most part. But then things take a shift, and that's when things get a little bit weird with Eva. Things get very weird. You see, when things take a shift in this, it becomes way more about Shinji, Asuka, and Rei. Probably mostly about Shinji. And the plot almost becomes more about them than anything else. And while that isn't necessarily a terrible thing, it isn't necessarily a good thing. So, since our plot is now the characters, I suppose the best thing we can do is talk about the characters. So we start off with Shinji Ikari. This kid is the one we're going to talk about the longest. You see, Shinji's mother is dead, and his dad's pretty distant. In fact, his dad pretty much hates the kid. And Shinji kind of hates himself. He has a lot of psychological torment, not to mention he's going through puberty basically when his world ends. So there's a lot more focus on him. So pretty much the series involves him thinking that he's this weasel, he's this coward, he's this sneak, and he's a conniving little bitch. And through the entire thing, he hates himself, and he doesn't understand why anybody could like him. Because of that, a lot of people call him whiny and annoying, and while I understand that there is a lot of hate for him, I don't hate him as much as others, simply because I feel that he is justified in some way because of his social situation. Now, Shinji is also a reluctant hero in this, and that's good and bad. See, they don't really make you like him very much, and that's kind of a problem with him. But overall, with Shinji, that's the gist of him. He hates himself, and he has to come to a conclusion later that we'll get into. And so we move on to Asuka. Asuka I have less to say about, because she's kind of this cocky, I'm the best kind Eva pilot there is, which she's not. You see, Asuka saw her mother die, and really if there was one character I had to pick to hate out of every character in Neon Genesis Evangelion, it would be fucking Asuka, because she's a bitch, and she doesn't really ever get better. I understand that seeing your mother die in front of you is very hard to deal with and everything, but you know what's worse is when Attack on Titan, those two main characters see their mother fucking eaten. And even though that kind of doesn't really make them much more or less one-dimensional, they still don't turn into complete fucking cunt bags, and that's the only word that I can think of to describe Asuka Soryu. And with that, I guess we're going to move on to Rei, who I don't have really much of anything to say about. Like I said, she's pretty much Shinji's mom, and Shinji has kind of a crush on her, along with Asuka. We'll delve a little bit more into that afterwards, but she's expendable and she knows that, so she's very emotionally unattached. Because of that, not much can be said about her. I can see why she's a fan favorite, because she has the less kind of drama bullshit going on, but she's still kind of bland and boring when you look at it. I mean, there's really nothing about her that's interesting. As I stated previously, Neon Genesis Evangelion in the last third becomes a lot more about these motherfucking characters. And again, mostly about Shinji. See, like I said earlier, Shinji hates himself and doesn't really see why others should like him. And there's a lot of sexual tension, actually, in this show. Because, characters are going through puberty. And none of it's really that weird until you get to the fucking movie. Oh, dear God, we're not going to talk about that. We're not talking about the movie. No. But essentially, Asuka's there to kind of be his coming-of-age girl. She's filled out, she's cocky and confident, and she doesn't seem quite like a kid, which gives Shinji kind of, a boner for her. The caretaker they have, he has one for her too, but Asuka's probably more of a focus than she is. Rei becomes a focus too, and that's when you get into the whole Oedipus thing. You see, the psychological drama in the show comes a lot from Freud, and while he's been discredited because he's not really using science, it's pretty interesting. And actually, the psychological states of these characters, as well as what they go through, is pretty well thought out. So, the problem with it is in the last third, it becomes very convoluted and very pretentious. Sometimes there's scenes of Asuka and Rei sitting in this elevator, and all that happens over the course of a couple minutes that it goes on is Asuka hiccups. That scene's unnecessary. There's no conversation. Nothing was explained. There's a scene where Shinji ends up killing a friend of his, whom he might be gay with. Yeah, it touches on that too. And there's this really long pause. I understand that he's distraught and is probably considering other options, but Christ, man. Like I said, and then the show starts to shove this existential egg down your throat, with Shinji eventually coming to the conclusion that he is him and wants to live. And while that makes sense to a degree, it doesn't really change anything, which is my main complaint with it. I am me and I want to live. But he never really just jumps into his role as an Eva pilot after that. He doesn't want to do it. He just wants to live. Which is where the selfishness in that whole thing comes in. If he decided he wanted to live and then fought for it, you could be like, okay, you're fighting for yourself. Yeah, I suppose, but it's better than, I want to live, but I'm not going to fight for it. What's the point in saying you want to live if you're not willing to fight for your own life? I mean, how many people are hostages and they decide they want to live, and because of that they do everything they have to over years and years of torment, and then escape because they wanted to live. They risk it. They fight. Shinji never does that. Fuckwit. And there's a lot of religious imagery in this show that almost just seems to be there just to be there. I mean, I have no problem with using religious imagery. It's very interesting and it can add a lot of depth to things. Symbolism in religion is very important and is included in a lot of things. However, if you're just going to shove it in there so you can seem deep, that's kind of a problem. I'm not saying that's with every single one of them, but it happens. And a lot of people try and pass off later in the show that it's becoming avant-garde and experimental. Okay, yes, it does become experimental, but at the same time, that's not completely because the director wanted that. They spent all their money in like the first season. The fuck? They had bad money management, and the guy was kind of crazy. Yeah, he went through 4 years of depression, and you can see with Shinji that he's passing that off on him, and that's understandable. But Jesus fucking Christ. Just because it's experimental doesn't mean it always works. Sometimes in the show, I'll admit, I kind of like it. Other times it doesn't really work. Overall, Neon Genesis Evangelion, or however the fuck you pronounce that, isn't bad. It did a lot of good for the robot anime style, and a lot of good for anime in general. I mean, fuck, we're still talking about it now. But there are some glaring problems in it. And I know these problems have probably been stated over and over again by everybody, but they're still there, and I think it's only fair that we acknowledge them and call it out on its bullshit every now and then. The show's still good, and I would recommend it to anybody that enjoys anime, and I would call it even a must-watch. But at the same time, I totally understand any hate for this show and anybody that doesn't like it. There's a lot to not like. The characters are complete unlikable bastards most of the time, and the movie makes it worse! God. Actually, that's enough of a reason right there. Watch all of Neon Genesis Evangelion. Go get Neon Genesis Evangelion, The End of Evangelion, which that title's a joke, by the way. Evangelion will never end. And then, after that, tell me how you feel about it. Because I almost feel like that movie will ruin it for you. It almost did for me. Also, one other reason to watch this show is it has the greatest opening theme ever. I'm going to link it in the description box. It's so fucking awesome. Yeah! Neon Genesis Evangelion, opening theme, 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5, 4 stars. Show, I give it a 3 out of 4 if I had to. Anyway, that's all I got for you. God, I just feel dirty now. I'm gonna go watch Yu-Gi-Oh!